So this morning, go ahead and put your thumb at the end of the book of Job. We're going to find ourselves in about chapter 38. It's kind of where we're going to be. But parents in the room, have your kids ever come up to you and asked this question? Why? Why? My kids, so I've got 3 kids. One is not talking yet. That's good. And then I have a second child. She's going to be 4 here in November. That's coming up. And then my third child, my first one, is going to be 6 here in just a few weeks. And that's incredible. And they are, the 2 older ones, they are definitely in a position where they are asking questions. They ask why. Why? Why? Hey, go do that. Why? Hey, why are we doing that? Why? And so I wonder if maybe I'm not the only one in the room that's done this, but have you ever been in the position when your children, especially, those toddlers, those 2s and 3s, they ask the why question, and have you ever just been in the position where you just say, because? Have you ever done that? Parents in the room, have you ever done, because I said so. And there's been this reality that as our kids ask why, that sometimes that's a cop-out. We just don't want to deal with it. We're done with it, whatever. We just because, okay? Just because. But sometimes that's the right answer. You ever been there? So they ask, why, Daddy? And you just say, because. Because that's actually the right answer. Or maybe it's, why, Daddy? And the answer is, honey, don't worry about it. Because that's what they need to know. They need to know that whatever the answer is, they just need not worry about it. What about this? Why, Daddy? Honey, you just wouldn't understand. Have you been in a position where you've answered the why question in any of those 3 ways? Done that? Yeah. And sometimes that's a cop-out. We just don't want to deal with it. But sometimes that is the right answer. You wouldn't understand. Don't worry about it. And only because I said so. That's the right answer. And we find ourselves at the end of the book of Job, where this book has built up and built up and built up. The first 2 chapters of Job, we get this really quick story about how Job suffers. How God views Job as a great man of God, how he is a God-fearing man, how he's done everything right, how he is a lover of God. That is Job. Satan approaches God, and Satan says, he will fall from you, God, if you just tempt him, if you just try him, if you just take what's his, if you make him suffer a little bit. And God says, no, he won't. So Satan goes in there, he takes everything from him, all his livestock, all of his belongings, his employees, his servants, and his family. All of his children, gone. In a matter of minutes, Job finds out about all of this. And yet, through chapter 1 and through chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, God still says this about Job: he did not sin. And then the next, 35-ish chapters are of Job asking questions. Like, why did you let me be born? Why did you even conceive me? Why am I here? Why is all this happening? All this kind of stuff. Why do you let good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? And all that. Job just really kind of throws it out there to God. And then in the middle of all of these kind of Job crying out, he has his, we'll use air quotes, friends that are accusing Job of being a downright awful human being. And that's why all these terrible things have happened to him. You see, Job, you're just a dirty, rotten dude. That's why God did this. And frankly, Job, he probably should have done more to you. That's his friends. And so in between this, we have 35-ish chapters of the why. The friends making statements of why, Job crying out, why, Daddy, all these kinds of things. We get this situation where these guys are either saying why or asking why or whatever. The why question for 35 chapters is pretty big. And we finally get to chapter 38 in the book of Job, where God finally speaks. And as a reader of the book of Job, and I hope you guys have spent some time in this book, and I hope you've taken the opportunity to read it in large chunks. Because if you have done that, if you've actually been able to read chapter 1 through 42 in one sitting, then you feel the tension. As you read more and more and more and more, and as Job doubles down on his questions and his assertion that he is good and that God has really done some things, he just wants to ask God these questions. He just wants to know why, and why isn't God hearing, and why isn't God listening, and all of these questions that Job has. And then as the friends double down on Job, you're just a bad dude. As all of this happens, you feel this tension in your stomach, and you want to know why. And even though we think we have a pretty good understanding of maybe why some of these things happen, or maybe what God would say, or maybe a pretty decent understanding of Scripture and suffering and our theology or doctrine of suffering and all these kinds of things, even as we might think that we have a decent understanding there, as we read the book of Job, you can't help but get through 38 chapters of Job and be like, yeah, I actually kind of would like to hear what God would say to some of this. And so there's kind of this breath of relief as you're reading it. You get to chapter 38, and you're like, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Finally. There's this kind of a sigh. Finally. So this morning, I want us to maybe look at what God says to the why question. When we cry out, or when Job cries out, why? Why, Father? Why, Daddy? Why, Lord? What's he say? So look with me, chapter 38. We're gonna read a lot of the text this morning because I love it. I love it. God finally speaks, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. So we don't know that he appeared in like a physical person or anything like that, but there's this indication that he speaks from a whirlwind. So this is a big scene of some kind. So it's I think it's unavoidable. I mean, I think this whirlwind is powerful. I think it's something that Job wasn't going to get away from. I mean, I think it was a big thing, and I think obviously Job knew it was God. There was no question. And so the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Look how he answers. Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? I mean, if you read the book of Job, and you're hearing all these questions, and you're hearing all these accusations about God, and you're hearing these friends say all this stuff they really don't know about, and you finally get to where God speaks. I mean, really, that's really not what you expect from God. You kind of expect a pat on the back from God that says, hey, Job, it's been rough, buddy. I know. Let me help you out. He says, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you. Oh, okay. That's a different tone than we probably expect for God to speak to a man who's been through all of this. Brace yourself like a man, because I've got some questions for you, and you must answer them. Here's verse 4. Here are the questions start. God answers the questions with questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you know so much, who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? Has the morning star sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb, and as I clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness? For I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far, no farther. Here your proud waves will stop. Whoa. I mean, God answers Job with these questions. He says, now wait a minute. I understand what you've said. You've asked all these things. You've accused me of all these things. You've wondered why I've done this or haven't done that or all these things. I just want to answer you with these questions. Are you God? That's what all these questions are asking, because there's not necessarily an answer here, except there's an answer here. We know the answer to all of these questions is God, the Creator, the Alpha, the Omega, the great I Am, the infinite, the omniscient, the omnipresent, the powerful. We know that God is the answer. We know that God set the foundation, that he set the surveying line, that he put the stars where they are, that he watched the choirs of angels sing as he did all of this, that he put the barriers around the seas so that it would be where it is. We know that. And Job knows that. And so in the midst of Job crying out to God and asking why, God's answer to the question, why, is, are you God? Are you God? Look at verse 13 now. He goes on, have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth to bring an end to night's wickedness? As the light approaches, the earth takes shape like clay pressed beneath a seal. It is robed in brilliant colors. The light disturbs the wicked and stops the arm that is raised in violence. Have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Like the imagery there is so powerful. Have you been to where the seas start? Have you explored their depths? Some scientists say that we know in many ways more about space than we know about our own depths of the seas, of our oceans. Some scientists would argue that we know less about the very depths of our own planet than we know about some of the things of space, because we can't even get to the bottom of our own planet yet. And God's asking Job, have you explored their depths? No. No, you haven't. And then he says this, verse 17, do you know where the gates of death are located? Have you seen the gates of utter gloom? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Tell me about it if you know, God cries. Where does the light come from? And where does the darkness go? Can you take each to its home? Do you know how to get there? And listen to what God says. But of course you know all of this. For you were born before it was all created, and you're just so very experienced. You want to know why I'm sarcastic? Because God's sarcastic. He got sarcastic with his own creature, his own son, his own Job. I mean, of course you can. Because the answer is no, you can't. You don't have a clue where death is. You don't have a clue where those gates are. You don't have a clue where the bottom of the ocean is. You don't have a clue where any of that stuff even comes from, because you are Job. And I am God. I love verse 22. Have you visited the storehouses of snow? Or seen the storehouses of hail? Like, this draws such a beautiful, awesome, cool picture of our creation. We take it for granted, we turn the weather channel on, and we see, the cold front, the stationary front, the warm front, and all this stuff, high pressure, low pressure, snow, rain, tornado, hurricane, whatever this stuff. And we just kind of take for granted that God actually does all that. And that he draws this image that he stores the snow. Like there's a storeroom somewhere. Like, he's like, all right, get the shovel out. Seneca, here it comes. We haven't seen that for a while. It draws such a powerful picture of his control over creation, that when it snows, when it rains, when it hails, like, that is him. He's doing all that. When the sun comes up, when the sun goes down, when the ocean rises, when the ocean sinks, that is God. That's him. He's telling Job, you don't understand, because you're not God. You're Job. And he still hasn't answered a single question that Job has asked, or any of the friends have brought up. He hasn't even got to that. He's setting the foundation for the rest of this chapter and the rest of chapter 39. He continues to speak in great detail about his infinitely controlling abilities of every little detail of creation. Nothing happens, nothing is sustained without what he does every day. He goes on in chapter 39 to speak about animals. He talks about their reproductive cycles. He talks about specific animals and the way they hunt and the way they eat and all these kinds of things. He says, do you know how all these things work, Job? No. Because you didn't make them. I did. I designed these things. I drew these ideas up. I put them in power. And I spoke them out of nothing. That was me. That wasn't you. We still haven't answered any of the questions. We're just setting the foundation. God is just asking one question to Job. Are you God? Finally, in chapter 40, verse 1, God says this. After 2 chapters of God just question, were you, are you, can you, should you, do you, all these things. I mean, just boom, 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 boom to Job, one after another. We finally get to chapter 40, verse 1. He says, then the Lord said to Job, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic. But do you have the answers? And Job's response is, then Job replied to the Lord, he said, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. You see, at the end of just 2 chapters, at the end of God just talking about creation, Job realized the answer. He was crying out, why? Why, God? Why, Lord? Why, Daddy? And God said, because. And after 2 chapters only, Job goes, that's enough. I'm sorry. I'm not God. I get it. I'm done. I get it. I relent. I have said too much. I have nothing more to say. The very next verse, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. I'm not done. I'm not done. And sometimes we're that way. Parents in the room, you've got kids. Why, Daddy? Because, honey. Why? I said so, honey. Why, Daddy? You've done that. We're that way. My children are the way they are because their mother's the way she is. And that's how it is. And so, I can relate to this. We all know. Okay, anyway. But Job is this way. God knew he still had questions. God wasn't done. He wanted to say this. And honestly, we get the benefit of reading this and experiencing this. Because God says, no, Job, I'm not done. Brace yourself like a man because I have some more questions for you. And you must answer them. And then verse 8 says this. Will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove you are right? And Job did that. He cried out to God, God, why don't you punish those wicked people over there? And why do they seem to thrive? And I can't believe that you would allow those people to do that. And God, why me? Because I'm without sin. Job was a good guy. I don't know if he's perfect, but that's between him and God. And so, all of these things. So Job really did question God's justice. And so now God finally looks at Job and says, no, I actually have some specific answers for those specific questions. Will you discredit my justice and condemn me? Condemn God? Just to prove you're right? Have you ever done that? Call God's love into question? Call God's grace into question? Call God's justice into question? Call God's wrath into question because maybe it doesn't align with what you are doing or are wanting to do or think you should be able to do? You ever called in the Alpha, the Omega's ability, character, perfection into question so that we can justify our behavior? Have you ever done that? Verse 9. Are you as strong as God? Can you thunder with a voice like his? All right. Put on your glory and splendor, your honor and majesty. Give vent to your anger. Let it overflow against the proud. Humiliate the proud with a glance. Walk on the wicked where they stand. Bury them in the dust. Imprison them in the world of the dead. Then even I would praise you, for your own strength would save you. God says, fine, Job, if you've got justice figured out, if you've got all this righteousness figured out, if you understand how the wicked should be punished, if you understand how the righteous should be rewarded, if you understand the perfection of justice, if you know the ins and outs of the deepest parts of every one of their souls, if you could truly be a righteous judge for them, then go for it. And then even I'll worship you. No way. No way. That's not permission from God. That's God just being pretty stern, pretty strong, making a pretty poignant point to Mr. Job that, Job, you don't have a clue. What you think is righteous is beyond you. What you think is wicked is beyond you. You don't get it, buddy. Yeah, we're in the same position. I mean, we look around, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? All that kind of stuff. And we think that we know who the good people are. And we think we know who the bad people are. And we think we know what is truly good and what is truly bad and all those kinds of things. And honestly, do we really? I mean, do we have the ability to see true good and true bad? I mean, do we? I mean, I would say that the creator of all, the great I am, has a better perspective from the throne of the universe than Job or than Joshua. For the rest of chapter 40 and into chapter 41, God begins to describe a couple animals, one called Behemoth, one called Leviathan. And he talks about how vast they are, how huge they are, how strong they are, how nobody has any authority over these animals, how nobody can touch them, how they're not hunted, no man has any power at all over these. He talks about one of them spits fire and smoke comes out of its nostrils and all these kinds of things. Some people say that they were dinosaurs or dragons and all these kinds of things. And the reality is this: I don't have an answer. I don't know. But I believe 100% that whatever these animals were, they are real, they are literal, and that they walked the earth, and that God made a point to Job, you know what I'm talking about, and only I tell them what to do. So you want to ask me about justice. You want to ask me about righteousness. You want to ask me about why. You can't even control the animals that walk around the earth. Only I can, says God. Chapter 38, chapter 39, chapter 40, chapter 41. God hammers Job with question after question after question of who are you? We finally get to chapter 42. Then Job replied. And as you're reading this, I hope you read it the same way I did. I mean, my pen was going nuts in these last few chapters, just circling and underlining and writing. And I just kept reading. It's like, man, I want to find out how this ends. I want to remember how this ends. I want to get to the end here. I want to find out what Job says. You just kind of get here. And finally in chapter 42 it says, Job replied. And I can only imagine his tone. Probably something like this. I know you can do anything, and no one can stop you. You ask me, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? It's I. And I was talking about things I knew nothing about. Things far too wonderful for me. You said, listen and I'll speak. I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. I had only heard you before, but now I have seen you with my eyes. I take back everything I said, and I sit in dust and ashes to show my repentance. Why, Daddy? Because I'm God and you're not. That's not the answer we want. I mean, there's even a temptation here to be frustrated with the way God answered the question. Because there's points in our life where we literally cry out, why? Why? Why, Daddy? Why, God? Why, Father? Are you allowing all this to happen to me, my family, my friends, whatever? And the honest answer is, it's so far beyond us. And frankly, that's a good thing. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. God shares a little bit about him. It says, the message of the cross, which is that of grace, which is that of sacrifice, which is that of God sending his Son to die on a cross for sinners. So the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But we who are being saved know is the very power of God. You see, God's ways are so far beyond ours. Because the reality is, if we could truly understand God, then we would have to look at God, and we would have to look at his Son Jesus, and we would have to look at the image of Jesus on the cross, and we would have to say, why, Daddy? Because I sinned. That's on me. That's not on you. That's not on Jesus. That's not on his cross. That's on me. Because if we truly understood, if we truly were the God we think we are sometimes, if we truly had a really good grip or grasp of reality or the nature of God's justice or righteousness, then we would truly have to accept the fact that we are with sin, that God is not, and because we are with it and he isn't, we have to stay away from him. And there is then no hope that we could enter into his presence. That is what would happen if we could truly understand God's justice and righteousness. If his justice and his righteousness was as simple as our understanding, then that's where we lay. But because he is so infinitely more God than we will ever aspire to be. Because his ways are so much beyond ours, as Isaiah says. Because the cross is foolishness to those of the world who don't understand it. But to those who understand that we are not God and he is, and that for whatever reason he has chosen to love us unconditionally, then we get to experience something as crazy and as ununderstandable as the cross in Jesus Christ. Because honestly, we should all be crying out to God today saying, why, Daddy? Did you love me so much to allow your Son to be killed on my behalf? And the answer will be, because I love you. But honestly, because I'm God and you're not. And you can't even begin to understand my connection to my creation. Like, you can't fathom it. You see, at the end of the day, when we cry out why to the Father and ask about suffering or ask about grace or ask about love or ask about punishment or whatever, we have to come to the grips of reality that at some point we have to understand that it is not going to be answerable. Because he is so much farther beyond where we could ever be. Why, Daddy? Because I love you in ways you could never understand. But what about suffering? What are you punishing me? No, I'm not punishing you. I paid for your sin through Jesus already. The punishment's been made. Jesus was punished for your sins. This isn't punishment. You ever think about that? You ever thought you were being punished for your sin? If you are a believer of Jesus, if you believe he died for your sin, then he was punished for your sin. What you're going through right now is not punishment for your sin. It may have a natural consequence. You may be dealing with some stuff because of it, but it is not God's punishment. If you believe God is punishing you for sin, then you believe that Jesus didn't die for you. And we believe Jesus died for us. Why, Daddy? Because he loves us. And so my challenge to you today is that we are going to have to understand God is God, and we are not. And sometimes the right answer to why is because. But with Job's repentance, God restored him. God forgave him. God blessed him, gave him everything back because of his humility and his accepting the fact that God is God and Job is not. And I will say this. Note, God never said Job said anything wrong. He did about the friends. It's not wrong to ask why. It's not wrong to pray out to God. But you got to understand your place. And Job did.